Well, hello everyone. My name's Louise Savage. Welcome back to my channel if you are a returning viewer, and a very warm welcome if you're watching for the first time. Well, it's getting very autumnal outside. The leaves are turning. There's a chill in the British air, and the supermarkets are absolutely full of pumpkins and all sorts of Halloween paraphernalia. Now, I'm not particularly a fan of the whole sort of Halloween opportunity to sell things. It seems to be a time of year where a pest of power becomes ever more important to the retailer, but it is definitely the time of year, bizarrely, to sort of sit down and curl up with something that gives you a bit of a chill, a bit of a thrill. I think you need a sort of good page turner or something that's really going to hold your attention as the nights draw in here on this side of the world. So this whole idea for this video kicked off because my October reading challenge book, Savage Reads Challenge, was to find a book with food in the title. So I found one book on my shelves that I felt qualified, and it's Joanne Harris's The Lollipop Shoes. Now you can see I've had this on my shelves for a very long time. This is a proof copy, and I think the book came out in about 2017, maybe even earlier than that. For some reason I read Chocolat years ago, saw the film, and I've not read a single Joanne Harris since, and I'm really not sure why that is, because I enjoyed Chocolat. And I'm really enjoying this, actually. It's a sequel to the original book. So for those of you who've read it, you'll be familiar with the characters of Vianne and Anouk, her daughter. Like Chocolat, it's full of kind of witchcraft and mystery and female sort of sinister powers. This novel finds Anouk and her mother in Paris. It's set in the Butte in Montmartre, somewhere that I know reasonably well, so that's quite nice personally to be able to sort of walk the streets again with the characters. Vienna's got herself into a relationship with Thierry, and he is a sort of quite a slick businessman, and if you know her character from before, you're not too comfortable with that. It doesn't seem to fit very well. Anouk is definitely not sure about the relationship, and Vienna also now has a 4-year-old daughter, Rosette, with red hair. I will say no more to those of you who know the previous story. So there's a real sense of unease. Anouk's not very comfortable at school. She's not fitting in. She's desperate to stay put. And then this other female figure, in fact, it starts with her, who is the wearer of the red lollipop shoes, walks into Montmartre. Her name is Zosie, and she also has a lot of the sort of mystic about her. And she begins to invade their lives. She's infiltrating herself. You know that she's up to no good from the very beginning. She is living under an assumed identity, and she's had several of those before. So yeah, it's really, it is just the perfect read for this time of year. I'm sort of curled up. I did feel to start with it was a little bit slow. I think the pace, it's a much longer book than Chocolat, and I don't really feel it needs to be. I think things are being spun out a little bit too much. But I am definitely really enjoying it, and all I want to do is to come home from work and sit and gobble up the rest of the book. I've nearly finished it. So that's The Lollipop Shoes by Joanne Harris. And then I started thinking about, you know, my first memories of reading and what sort of spooky and thrillery type stories that I would recommend that I've read over the years. And bizarrely, I got whisked away to a beach in Carnac in Brittany when I was about 11 or 12. I think I'd just started secondary school. And my sister and I, we had an absolute battle on our hands because we were racing our way through Agatha Christie. And I don't know if I associate Agatha Christie with spookiness and unease, but I do really remember, and you can see this is an original. This is the original copy that I read as an 11-year-old. It's got a very sort of immature signature there in the front pages. And so this is Agatha Christie's Murder in Mesopotamia. And I remember really being absolutely gripped by this, and so was my sister as well. And I remember it just making my spine tingle. I must reread it. I think I'm going to listen to it again on Audible and see if it still has that effect. But basically the premise of the book is that it's set in the Iraqi desert. What's not to like about that? At an archaeological site, and the wife of the chief archaeologist, who's very sort of well known, he is, not her, and she's become ill. She started to have all these hallucinations and visions, and spooky things are going on. And a nurse is flown out to look after her, and it soon becomes clear that this is not any ordinary illness. And yeah, Poirot, of course, is sent for to investigate. But I just remember it really lying there on a very hot beach, being chilled to the bone by the details of this story. So there you go, that's Agatha Christie. And then I thought about this wonderful anthology of stories. I mean, I think Roald Dahl has not been forgotten as a short story writer, but certainly when I was younger, his Tales of the Unexpected were on the telly all the time. And I think he's an absolutely superb short story writer. And these short stories, I mean, there are several volumes of them. This one is called Kiss Kiss, as you can see. And my favourite story is actually the opening one. I think it's called The Landlady. And it's really, really chilling. There's taxidermy involved, and it's told from the perspective of a young lad, Billy, who comes to lodge at this landlady's house. You know, he's reasonably innocent, and it's just not very pleasant what happens. And then later on in the story, later on in the collection, there's a story called something like The Way Up to Heaven. And the action takes place in a lift, and that's that story stayed with me for years and years and years. So again, I thought if you fancy sort of short bursts of spine-chingling stuff, then I think any of Roald Dahl's short story collections. My favourite one isn't of all of his short stories. It's not in this one. It's called The Lamb to the Slaughter, and it's a absolutely brilliant story of revenge, a pregnant wife taking revenge on her husband, who's been an absolute nasty piece of work and happens to be a policeman as well. That's a superb story. I daren't say any more about it because I might give things away. So there you go. I really recommend those to you for this time of year. And then I started thinking about, you know, what are the features of Halloween? Well, definitely witches are a feature. And this is The Witchfinder's Sister by Beth Underdown. Now, I think this came out before the Manningtree Witches. I think several years before, I could be wrong. And actually it's a novel set in Manningtree, and the sister is, the Witchfinder is Matthew Hopkins, which the Manningtree Witches focuses on his story. For me personally, this book was much more readable. I enjoyed the plot more. I think I found out more about Matthew Hopkins than I did in Blakemore's book. The premise of this is that the sister has been living away from Manningtree. She got married, she moved, but her husband's died and she's had to return. And in that time, things have changed in the household that she left behind, and her brother has really changed. And he's got this book which he's keeping, you know, he's got the names of local women written in the book, and she's the sense of unease in the novel is really well drawn, and I love it. It's a book about loyalty. It's a book particularly about religiosity and superstition, and actually the impact all of that has on women. The only way that I've forgotten the sister's name. What's she called? That's awful. I can't remember her name. Alice, that's it. So Alice, the only way that Alice can kind of cope in the household is by being really compliant and really good. And I think that's often a pressure that women are put under, almost not to be noticed, because of course she's terrified of what's going on. But equally in the household, there's an extremely unpleasant servant who Alice is terrified of, and rightly so. It's almost like Alice is a prisoner in her own home at points. And, you know, that's another way of surviving, isn't it? By spying and being deceitful and dishonest. And one of the interesting characters in it is Alice's mother-in-law. Very soon after her return to Manningtree, she goes to visit her mother-in-law, who was a very close friend of Alice's mother. And the mother-in-law is an older woman. She's very outspoken. Of course, she's absolute prime target for Matthew Hopkins' work. So her story becomes, you know, really important in the plot. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I don't find this as often on the shelves in bookshops as I do the Manningtree Witches, but there we are. It's all down to personal taste, isn't it? But I love that. And thinking of witches took me back to the original witch, in my view. Well, it could be Medea. But equally it could be Circe. And Madeline Miller's Circe, if you want a witch of a very different class and character, look no further than this novel. Circe is a character from Greek mythology. She encounters, or Odysseus encounters her on his return from Troy. He stays with her for a year because she beguiles him. And she, you know, the way this novel picks up on her isolation, her loneliness, it gives the witch a really plausible character, and it's not particularly spooky, but it does look at witchcraft in a very different way. And actually, if you enjoyed Hamnet, there are lots and lots of moments in this story that really remind me of Hamnet. The mixing of potions, the gathering of herbs, all that kind of activity. There's definitely a connection in my mind between the two things. And then I thought, well, we have witches and we have ghosts. And I mentioned this book briefly in passing in a previous video because in fact, I think it was last week, because I'd picked up another ghost story by Michelle Paver. I really enjoyed reading Dark Matter. I love Michelle Paver's writing. I think the way she sort of looks at nature and the natural world is really interesting. So this is the story of a young man, Jack, in the 1920s, and he is poor, he's lonely, he's desperate for adventure. So he's offered the role of radio operator on an Arctic expedition, and he snaps it up and off he goes. And they sail off up to the frozen north and end up on this extremely deserted, uninhabited bay. And gradually, one by one, all the other members of the expedition have to leave for one way or one reason or another. There are 5 of them to start with and 8 huskies. And Jack has to make a decision whether he's going to stay on his own. Now, when they arrived, it was summer. But as the other members of the expedition leave, it gets darker and darker and darker. The long Arctic night has arrived, and the seas are going to freeze, and Jack makes a decision to stay, and he's alone, but he absolutely is not alone. There's another presence out there on the Arctic ice. And yeah, I think it's really clever. I think it's a very clever and interesting and difficult, challenging setting for a writer to produce a ghost story in. I really admire it. And then another book about haunting, The Haunting of Henry Twist. I read this some years ago by Rebecca E. John, and this is a book that haunted me. It stayed with me all that time. It's not perfect. The plot is a little bit, I don't know, there's something about the editing and the plot that could do with perhaps a little bit of work. But I really loved this book, and I loved Henry. So Henry Twist, at the beginning of the novel, is newly married to his wife Ruby. They're expecting a baby, and then she is tragically killed in an accident with a bus. Really sudden, really unexpected, and that whole sense of your life being turned upside down is told really well from Henry's perspective. And then, of course, Henry is left with a young child. He's a single parent, a baby with him. And it's the 1920s, and that's unusual. That's not the norm. And Henry's absolutely terrified. The power of love that this man has for this child and his wife. He's absolutely terrified that somebody's going to take this baby away. And a bit like Alice in the Witchfinder story, he copes by trying to remain unseen. He doesn't want the society, he doesn't want the neighbours to sort of notice him. And then one day he's leaving the house one evening, and out of the shadows steps this character called Jack. And Jack has lost his memory, or he claims to have. The only things that he can remember are his own name and Henry's name. And Henry doesn't recognise him. Henry does not feel that he knows this man. But Jack becomes really entangled in Henry's life. And the reason this book haunted me and stayed with me, I think, is because it's a book very much about love, about different types of love, about the difficulties of a man in society. And I think it's probably still true today to a degree. It's still very unusual for a man to be bringing up the children for whatever reasons, and the sort of pressures that puts you under. So it's just a book absolutely full of warmth and full of heart. I really commend it to you. And then the title alone should absolutely set this novel up for a Halloween read. I'm Not Scared by Niccolo Ammaniti. I've banged on about this book before, but I don't care. I'm banging on about it again. Niccolo Ammaniti is one of my favourite authors, especially if you want something sinister and uneasy and creepy and gruesome. So I'm Not Scared is told from the perspective of a 9-year-old boy, Michele. It opens with the most beautiful and nostalgic scene of a group of children racing across wheat fields in the near an Italian village, and they're racing towards this dilapidated house, and there's that whole sense of threat. The leader of the gang is Skull, and it's obviously a challenge who's going to get there first, and Michele is last. And as a result, he has to pay this penalty. He has to walk across the second floor of this very dangerous building because it's falling down. He then has to jump out the window, grab a tree, blah, 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 just as children do, and he falls. And when he falls, he finds this hole that's been covered over, and in it is the body of a child. It turns out the child is alive. It turns out the child has been kidnapped by his own father and a group of villagers, and it's just this really unsettling story. It's for me it's very much a nature nurture novel, and a sort of loss of innocence novel, because Michele is not like his family. He sees the whole scenario from a very different perspective. They've been driven to kidnap this child because of poverty. You know, they see it as a way out of their poverty, and they are envious of the wealth of the family that the young boys come from, etc, etc. So yeah, I'm Not Scared. If you want something to chill your spine and make you feel deeply uneasy, this is definitely a novel to go to. And then finally, of the books I've read, another novel that really creeped me out, and I think again it's wonderful. It's got a staircase, you know. This is I Saw a Man by Owen Sheers. I read this because I heard him being interviewed about it on James Nocty's book programme. It's available on the BBC. And in that radio programme, he sits in a very small studio with a small audience and the author, and they discuss, it's like a special book club, they discuss one of the author's books. And I've heard Owen Sheers and James Nocty in the audience talking about this book, and I had to get a copy, and I managed to get a second-hand one. I think this was £2 in a second-hand bookshop, and I loved this. It's not, again, it's not perfect, but it's Owen Sheers is a poet, so he writes beautifully. It tells the story of Michael, who was widowed in America. He's American. He was widowed. His wife was working as a news reporter or a photographer, trying to sort of expose or create a documentary about Islamic jihad. and jihadis, and she was killed by a drone strike. And so it's very, very much a novel about masculine grief, which I found really interesting. But Michael comes to England and he settles into this neighbourhood, and he becomes extremely close with his neighbours. It's a married couple with 2 young girls. They become so close that he regularly babysits the children. They're in and out of each other's houses. But one day he goes to their house to borrow something, and the front door's open and nobody's in. And he goes in and he sort of starts to explore the house, almost from a kind of stranger's perspective. And then something really, really horrendous happens. And I can't tell you anymore because I would ruin it. But I found this book, I devoured it. And yeah, it definitely is very much about male relationships, male grief, and well written. So I've read all of those books. So what am I going to spook myself with this Halloween season? So I have had on my shelves for ages this pink gorgeousness, Her Majesty's Royal Coven by Juno Dawson. And I know that this is about witches and witchcraft. I don't know an awful lot more about it, or at least I did and I've forgotten. But I don't know why. You'll see all 3 of the books that I'm planning to read, apart from ones that I've bought recently and you've seen me talk about over this autumn, are all big tomes. I think it's the time for big chunky books. Maybe it's a reaction to Shorty September, I don't know. So I'm going to try and read that. I've also found on my shelves a book by Audrey Niffeneger called Ghostly, and this is full of ghost stories. It's got some rather nice illustrations and things inside as well. And I thought, yeah, that sounds nice, worth dipping into. And I haven't read anything by Audrey Niffeneger for a long time. She wrote The Time Traveller's Wife, which I thought was utterly brilliant. I loved that novel, even though there are some questionable aspects to it about, you know, male violence and relationships with young girls, but I still thought it was a very compelling novel. And I've also read another one by her, which the name escapes me, The Vanishing of Someone, I think it's called, can't remember, which I quite enjoyed as well. So yeah, I'm going to try and sort of read Ghostly. And I'm also going to get round finally to reading Kate Moss's The Ghost Ship. I don't know how I haven't got onto this yet, because I've had this in my possession for a little while, but I want to bang on and read that. So that's my spooky, aren't they lovely? All 3 hardbacks, all very glossy and shiny and lovely, full of autumn loveliness. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, I hope you're having a good autumn. I hope the leaves rustle and crackle and fall. I know in certain parts of the world that's not possible, but sending you lots of crisp autumn love from my little library in Shropshire, England. And yeah, look forward to talking to you all next week. Please post below your autumn suggestions, particularly anything spooky and Halloweeny. Take care all. Bye.